You've done the work. You've read the books, sat with the patterns, maybe even spent years in therapy piecing together exactly why you are the way you are. And then you walk into a new relationship, and somehow you become the same person again. In 1895, a young Viennese physician named Joseph Breuer made a decision that would cost him one of the most important friendships of his life. For years, Breuer had been the closest colleague and mentor of a younger doctor, a man who was still developing his ideas, still searching for the language to describe what he was observing in his patients. That younger doctor was Sigmund Freud. Breuer had supported Freud financially, professionally, personally, had treated him like a son in many ways, had opened his own most difficult clinical cases to him, including the famous case of a patient Freud would later write about as Anna O., a young woman whose symptoms had defied every conventional treatment and who had, under Breuer's care, learned to talk her way through them. It was a groundbreaking case, and Breuer had shared it with Freud generously, trusting that Freud's brilliant, restless mind would find in it what he himself had not. But when Freud began to insist that sexual conflict lay at the root of all neurosis, when he pushed his theories further and further into territory that Breuer found both scientifically premature and professionally dangerous, Breuer pulled back. He distanced himself. He stopped endorsing Freud's ideas publicly. He retreated into the safety of his established reputation, the one he'd spent 30 years building, the one he was not willing to risk. Freud never forgot it. For the rest of his life, he spoke of Breuer with a bitterness that his closest associates found difficult to understand, a wound so disproportionate to what had actually happened that it became in itself a clinical curiosity among the people who knew them both. What had Breuer actually done? He had been a cautious man who had loved Freud genuinely, and then chose self-preservation over loyalty at exactly the moment Freud needed him most. It was a betrayal of a kind, but not an unusual one, not one that should have scarred a man who claimed to understand the unconscious better than almost anyone alive. Unless the wound was not really about Breuer, unless Joseph Breuer had walked into a role that had been waiting for him long before they ever met. The role of the person who gets close, earns trust, offers something essential, and then withdraws it at the critical moment. Freud's father had been a man of warmth and promise who had experienced financial ruin in Freud's childhood, who had, in some fundamental way, failed to provide what his family needed precisely when that stability was most required. Freud had never fully resolved his feelings about that. His own self-analysis, extensive as it was, had circled the wound without quite landing on it. And so when Breuer, older, established, generous, paternal, chose his reputation over his loyalty, something in Freud recognized the shape of the room. Not consciously, not as a thought, but as a feeling so old and so deep that it arrived with the force of original injury. Breuer, without knowing it, without intending it, had simply filled the part. The Buddhism had a name for the mechanism behind this 2,000 years before Freud was born. You know the feeling, not the dramatic version, not the obvious one where you end a relationship and immediately start dating someone who is clearly the same person in different clothes. The subtler version, the one where you're in a relationship that feels completely different from the last one. Different person, different dynamic, different set of problems. And then one afternoon, you notice something. The way you go quiet when a certain kind of tension enters the room. The way your stomach tightens when they don't reply for a few hours and you find yourself composing explanations for their silence before you've even asked them what's wrong. The way you find yourself managing their mood before they've even said anything is wrong. Anticipating, smoothing, adjusting yourself to something that hasn't happened yet. Or the opposite. The way you find yourself pulling back just as things are getting genuinely close. Inventing small distances, becoming slightly less available than you were last week without quite being able to explain why. And you think, I've been here before, not with this person, but in this shape, in this particular arrangement of distance and need and careful silence. You've tried to change it. You've talked about it with people who love you. You've named it in therapy until the name lost its power. You've gone into the next relationship with a clear list of what to do differently, and then watched yourself, slowly, over months, to drift back into the same configuration. As if the self has a preferred shape, it returns to under pressure, the way a bent wire springs back the moment you let go. There is a reason this happens, and it's not what most people assume when they first encounter it. Most people, when they recognize a pattern, assume the solution is to understand it better, to trace it back further, to find the original wound, to name the parent or the moment or the relationship that installed this particular way of being. And that understanding is not useless, but it turns out to be insufficient, because people who understand their patterns completely still repeat them. People who can describe with clinical precision exactly why they do what they do in relationships and then go home and do it again. The understanding and the change are not the same thing. They are reached by different routes. Buddhism has been working on this problem for 2,000 years, and the answer it arrived at is both simpler and harder than most people expect. The word is vasana. It comes from Sanskrit, and it translates roughly as fragrance, or more precisely, the scent left behind by something that has passed through. Imagine burning incense in a room. The incense burns, the smoke dissipates, the moment is gone, but the fragrance remains, absorbed into the fabric of the curtains, the grain of the wooden furniture, the fibers of everything the air touched. Long after the incense is gone, the room still carries its trace. That's a vasana, not a memory, not a habit in the behavioral sense, not a belief you can examine and revise. A vasana is the residue of experience absorbed so deeply into the structure of the self that it shapes perception itself, the lens through which you see new situations before you've even consciously registered what's happening. Vasanas are formed by repetition. The same experience happening again and again leaves a progressively deeper impression. The way a path forms through a field, not by any single person deciding to make a path, but by enough feet walking the same way that eventually the grass simply stops growing there. And the deepest vasanas, the ones that most powerfully shape how you move through relationships, were formed before you were old enough to know you were forming them. The specific quality of attunement in your earliest attachments, the emotional atmosphere of the household you grew up in, not the dramatic incidents, but the daily texture, the unspoken rules about what feelings were acceptable, what kinds of love were available, what happened when you needed something that the people around you couldn't give. All of this left fragrance, and that fragrance is still in the room. The psychoanalyst Christopher Bollas, working from a completely different tradition than Buddhism, but arriving at strikingly similar ground. Call this the unthought known, the things we know in our bodies before we know them in our minds, the knowledge that lives below language, below conscious memory, below the reach of even the most determined self-examination. You cannot think your way out of a vasana any more than you can think the scent out of a curtain. And this is the reason that understanding a pattern is not the same as changing it. You can understand precisely and accurately exactly why you tend to disappear in relationships, to make yourself smaller, to give more than you receive, to choose connection over self-respect and then resent the person you chose it with. You can trace it all the way back. You can name the moment it started. You can explain it to someone else in language that is clear and true. And then the next person arrives, someone genuinely different, someone you chose carefully, someone who is not that. And the vasana rises anyway. Not because you haven't done the work, because the work of understanding and the work of transformation are two different kinds of work. There is a reason for this that goes beyond psychology. Buddhism, and specifically the Yogacara school of Buddhist philosophy that developed in India around the 4th century, mapped the mechanism in considerable detail. They described what they called the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, a layer of the mind below ordinary awareness, where all experience is deposited, where every vasana accumulates and from which they arise, seeding perception, shaping experience, generating the conditions for the same patterns to recur, without ever fully surfacing into conscious thought. The storehouse doesn't forget. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't respond to insight. It simply holds and releases and holds again, which means that every new relationship is entered not just by you, but by everyone who has shaped you, by every relational vasana accumulated across the years of your formation. You bring them all to the table, and so does the other person. And what passes between two people is not just what they intend toward each other, it is also the conversation between their respective fragrances, the way one person's vasana can activate another's without either person quite understanding why the temperature in the room just changed. Think about what this actually looks like in practice. Someone says something, a neutral thing, a logistical thing, a thing that in another context would carry no particular charge. And something in you shifts, not because of what they said, because of how they said it, the tone, the slight withdrawal in the voice, the fraction of a second of hesitation before they answered. None of these things, taken in isolation, would mean anything, but your storehouse consciousness, your alaya vijnana, cross-references them against everything it holds, and finds a match, not a perfect match, not the same person, but the same frequency. And the response that arises in you is not a response to this person in this moment. It's a response to every person who ever carried that frequency, every time the temperature dropped before something went wrong, every time the hesitation preceded a withdrawal, every time you scanned for the thing that was about to change. The other person has no idea this is happening. They said a neutral thing. They had a slightly distracted afternoon. They paused because they were thinking. And you are already, quietly, preparing for something that may not be coming. This is not paranoia. This is not irrationality. This is a nervous system doing exactly what it was trained to do, protecting you from a pattern it has learned to recognize with extraordinary sensitivity. The problem is not that the system is broken. The problem is that it's too good. too fast, too certain. It fires before you can reason with it, before you can ask, is this actually happening, or am I in the old room again? There is a koan in the Rinzai Zen tradition, one that frustrated students for centuries before anyone wrote it down. That goes something like this. A student approaches the master and says, I have understood impermanence. I have understood that the self is not fixed. I have understood that my suffering arises from clinging. The master says, good. Now understand it again. For the first time, the student doesn't know what to say. What the master was pointing at is the difference between conceptual understanding and what Buddhism calls direct realization, the knowing that has moved from the head all the way into the body, into the nervous system, into the moment before thought arrives. A vasana is not addressed by conceptual understanding. It is addressed by something that reaches it at its own level, in the body, in the moment of its arising, before the story begins. Now here is where the teaching becomes both more useful and more uncomfortable, because vasanas do not only explain why you keep becoming the same version of yourself in relationships, they also explain something about the people you choose, not in the shallow pop psychology sense of you're attracted to unavailable people, though that may be true, when in a more specific sense, the vasanas you carry create a kind of perceptual field, a set of frequencies you're tuned to receive. You don't just repeat your own patterns. You enter a room and certain people become visible to you in a way that others simply don't. Not because of what they look like or what they say or even how they treat you in the early days when everyone is on their best behavior, but because something in the way they carry themselves, the particular combination of warmth and withholding, closeness and unpredictability, presence and the hint of possible absence, resonates with a frequency you recognize from a very long time ago. It feels like chemistry. It feels like recognition. Sometimes it is. And sometimes what you're recognizing is not the person in front of you. It's the shape of an old room. The developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth, in her decades of research on attachment, documented something that Buddhist practitioners might have recognized immediately, that people don't just seek attachment, they seek familiar attachment, not happiness, not ease, not safety necessarily, but the particular texture of connection that matches the pattern established in the earliest relationships, because the nervous system knows how to navigate what it already knows. The familiar, even when it hurts, has the advantage of legibility. You know the rules of this room, and the unfamiliar, the person who is genuinely steady, genuinely available, genuinely not going to withdraw, can feel at first almost boring, or suspicious, or simply not quite real. Not because you don't want steadiness, but because steadiness doesn't activate the frequency you're tuned to receive. This is not a character flaw. It is not a failure of will or intelligence or self-awareness. It is simply what vasanas do. They make certain things feel like home, even when home was a place you needed to leave. There is something that needs to be said plainly about what this teaching does and does not promise. Buddhism does not say that understanding vasanas will dissolve them. It does not say that if you do enough meditation, enough therapy, enough honest self-examination, you will eventually be freed of these deep impressions and enter relationships as a kind of blank slate, unmarked by history, open to anything, no longer predisposed toward particular patterns. That's not what transformation looks like. The fragrance doesn't disappear. What changes is your relationship to it. There is also something harder to say, which is this: some patterns, honestly examined, turn out to be responses to real harm, not distortions, but adaptations. The self that disappears in relationships may have learned to disappear because disappearing was once the safest option available. The self that manages others' moods before they've spoken may have learned that skill in an environment where not doing so had real consequences. Buddhism does not ask you to simply override what was once a legitimate survival strategy. It asks you to notice carefully, without judgment, whether the strategy is still serving you in the situation you're actually in. Because the Vasana doesn't know the war is over. It doesn't receive updates. It runs the same program it ran the first time. But in every situation that rhymes with the original, whether or not the threat is real. And the cost of running an old program in a context that no longer requires it is not just inefficiency. It's the slow accumulation of a life spent responding to a room you're no longer standing in. There is also this: changing a Vasana requires repeated new experience, not one insight, not one breakthrough, not one relationship where you finally do it differently. Repeated, in the body, over time. Which means the work is slow. Which means there will be setbacks that look like failures but are actually just the depth of the impression asserting itself. Which means that the person who has been working on this for 10 years and still finds themselves in the familiar shape is not failing. They are working with something that is very old, very deep, and constitutionally resistant to hurry. If you're somewhere in your 40s or 50s and you're sitting with the recognition that this pattern, this particular shape of yourself in relationship, has been present for most of your adult life, there may be a specific kind of weariness in that recognition. Not the weariness of someone who hasn't tried. The weariness of someone who has tried sincerely and repeatedly and found that the trying itself didn't quite reach the thing that needed reaching. I want to say something specific to that weariness. The Vasana you carry is very old, probably older than your oldest clear memory. It was formed when you were small enough that the people around you were the entire world, when their moods were weather systems you had no shelter from, when their approval or withdrawal was not a preference, but a necessity. The self that formed itself in that environment was not weak. It was resourceful. It was doing exactly what was required to navigate conditions that a small person could not have otherwise survived. That resourcefulness is still in you, and the fact that you are here, that you have built a life, that you are still asking these questions, that is the evidence of it. But here's the thing I want to say to the person who has been working on this for a long time and is tired of trying. The weariness itself is information. It means you have been trying to change something using effort, using willpower, using the determined application of understanding to a problem that does not respond to understanding. That is exhausting. Of course it is, because it is the wrong tool for the job. The Vasana was not installed through effort. It was installed through repetition, through the body learning something over and over and over until it knew it without needing to think. And the only way to address it is through the same route it arrived, not through effort, but through presence, through the patient, repeated practice of noticing, in the body, in the moment before the story, what is actually happening, not fixing it, not correcting it, just seeing it. The Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah, a Thai forest monk who taught in the mid-20th century, and whose practical clarity has outlasted most of his contemporaries, used to say, if you want to understand the mind, sit down and watch it. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to change it. Just watch. It sounds passive. It is. In fact, the most demanding thing most people will ever attempt, because what watching requires is the willingness to see what's actually there, not the version of yourself you've constructed through years of analysis, not the story you tell about why you are the way you are, but the raw moment of the vasana arising, the tightening in the chest before you've named it, the slight shift in posture when the familiar frequency appears, the beginning of the old movement before it has become the old movement. The capacity for that quality of watching, not reactive, not corrective, just clear, is not something that comes quickly. It comes from years of practice, from the accumulated patience of someone who has had enough experience of their own mind to know when to be still. That capacity belongs to you. It was not available to you 20 years ago in the same way it is now. You are not starting late. You are starting with the specific tools that this particular work requires. A Thai forest monk who taught in the mid-20th century and whose practical clarity has outlasted most of his contemporaries used to say, if you want to understand the mind, sit down and watch it. Don't try to fix it. Don't try to change it. Just watch. It sounds passive. It is, in fact, the most demanding thing most people will ever attempt, because what watching requires is the willingness to see what's actually there, not the version of yourself you've constructed through years of analysis, not the story you tell about why you are the way you are, but the raw moment of the vasana arising, the tightening in the chest before you've named it, the slight shift in posture when the familiar frequency appears, the beginning of the old movement before it has become the old movement. The capacity for that quality of watching, not reactive, not corrective, just clear, is not something that comes quickly. It comes from years of practice, from the accumulated patience of someone who has had enough experience of their own mind to know when to be still. That capacity belongs to you. It was not available to you 20 years ago in the same way it is now. You are not starting late. You are starting with the specific tools that this particular work requires. The one thing I'd like to leave you with is not a practice with steps. It's an invitation to a different kind of attention. The next time you find yourself in a familiar emotional position, going quiet when you'd rather speak, managing someone's mood that isn't yours to manage, feeling the pull toward a distance that you recognize but can't quite explain, before the story begins, before the analysis starts, before you try to understand what's happening, just notice where it lives, in the body, the specific location of the old shape, the chest, the shoulders, the particular quality of the breath, that slight tightening, that familiar bracing, that almost imperceptible shift in posture that happens before you've consciously decided anything, not to fix it, not to override it, not to perform a different version of yourself, just to be the one who is noticing, which is different from being the one who is running, because the vasana has no awareness of itself. It is only fragrance. The awareness is yours, and awareness held steadily over time is the only thing that can slowly open a window in a room that has been closed for a very long time. This is not fast. It does not happen in a single session of meditation or a single breakthrough in therapy. or a single relationship where you finally do it differently. It happens in the accumulation of small noticings, over months, over years, in the ordinary, uncinematic moments when the old shape rises and you catch it, just barely, just for a second, before it has fully formed. Those moments are not failures, they are the work. Joseph Breuer never understood what role he had played in Freud's inner life. He died in 1925, largely unaware that he had walked into a drama written before they ever met. Freud, for all his extraordinary self-knowledge, never fully freed himself from the wound either. He understood it. He analyzed it. He wrote about it, but the understanding and the freedom turned out to be two different destinations. That is not a failure. It is an honest account of how hard this is. And it is perhaps enough to simply know the difference, to know that understanding the fragrance in the room is not the same as being free of it, and to keep watching anyway, because the watching is not nothing. Every moment of genuine noticing is a moment in which something more than the vasana is present, and that something, that awareness that can see the pattern without being entirely consumed by it, is what slowly, quietly changes the room. If what we've talked about today recognized something in you, something you felt for a long time without quite having the language for it, don't rush past it. Let it find its level. Come back to it tomorrow, in a different context, and notice whether it means something different then. Next time, we're going to look at something that grows directly from this. What Buddhism says about grief in the specific case of someone who is still alive. The loss of a relationship that didn't end cleanly. The mourning of something that never quite got to be what it should have been. The kind of loss that doesn't get acknowledged because the person is still there, just no longer reachable in the way you needed. That one is closer to more people than most would admit. I'll see you there. And if this has been worth your time, if it named something, the simplest thing you can do is stay. There's more of this to come.